I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views.
Hello, this is Mike Swanson. In a few moments, you're going to listen to another segment of Parallax Views. But before you do that, let me tell you about my new book, Why the Vietnam War. It's a sequel to my previous book called The War State, which has lots of positive reviews on Amazon. It's been out for years. But this one is a more detailed case study of how American empire and national security state operate using Vietnam. And I believe it shows also how things work today, how policy is actually made and why. So grab the book on Amazon.com, Why the Vietnam War.
This episode of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 tier and above supporters of Parallax Views on patreon.com/Parallax Views, and those supporters get a producer's credit shout-out on each and every edition of the show. So, producers' credit shout-outs to Mark, Arlen, Spartacus, Gunner, Ed, Gratz, James, Mickey, Brian, The Warner, The 42 Group, Nick, Emilia, Chase, Chris, Orc, Black Tuna, Nathan, David, Holland, Martin, Stu, Jeffrey, Thomas, Elliot, Colin, Michael, Matthew Ho, Brace, Galen, Justin, Nick W., and The Mere Project, MEER. Thank you again to all of those $10 tier and above supporters on my Patreon page. You can join them at patreon.com/parallaxviews. It's those producers credit supporters that can really help this show keep going, and their support is very much appreciated. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. On this edition of the program, we're going to be talking about Alexander Dugin, the Russian philosopher who has been called Putin's brain. Is he a traditionalist, an Orthodox Christian, an occultist, a Russian imperialist, or a mix of all of the above? We're going to be exploring all that and more on this edition of Parallax Views with guest Franco Malic of Kali Tribune. This conversation was recorded back in April, so keep that in mind as the Ukraine conflict is mentioned in the course of our conversation. And with that being said, let's get right to it with Franco Malic. Welcome to Parallax Views, a guest that I'm very interested to be speaking with, Franco Malic of the Kali Tribune. How are you doing today?
Oh, doing great. How are you doing?
Doing very good, And we're going to be talking about a figure that's sort of been on people's minds lately due to the Ukraine invasion. Alexander Dugin, who's been known as Putin's brain or Putin's Rasputin. And I think both you and I have often held the view in the past that Dugin was kind of a ridiculous character, that he was, on the outs, especially after he was, I think, more or less expelled or became a disgraced academic after a kerfuffle with Moscow State University. But before we get into all of that, just for the sake of my listeners, maybe you could talk a little bit about your background and where you come from in terms of, I don't want to say ideology, but like how you think about the world and just that kind of thing.
Well, I'm a philosophy graduate. I have a master's in philosophy, and I publish on subjects related to classical or traditional philosophy, as I like to put it. My outlook would be to observe things through lenses of, let's say, traditional metaphysics, along the lines of what philosophy used to be before maybe Renaissance or something like that. It may seem a bit far-fetched, but in fact it's not. It's kind of like philosophical outlook or worldview that is still present among many people, that is even part of our ancestral common sense, but it is not in focus in modernity, and especially now in so-called postmodernity. So I cover subjects on a rather broad range from post-humanism lately to social analysis, even maybe some politics, but not. I don't have a very hard political focus. And ideology, I wouldn't say I have one. I wouldn't call myself to be in possession of any ideology. So this doesn't make me neutral, of course, but I really couldn't pinpoint myself in some kind of systematic political outlook. And Dugin was, among others, for a period quite in a focus of my, let's call it, research.
Yeah, I just wanted to get that out of the way because a lot of my listeners may come from a left or materialist perspective. I have other listeners that come from other perspectives, so I always like to get where my guests are coming from. But with all that being said, maybe you could tell my listeners just a little bit about Kali Tribune and how it started, just maybe in a minute or so.
Well, Kali Tribune is a project I started first in Croatian. Now it's bilingual site. It has English and Croatian version. And interesting thing, I started Kali Tribune when I wrote an article on Dugin for one Croatian, in fact, leftist magazine, but not internet magazine, but regular paper magazine, a review of a book that was translated in Croatian. And then when I realized that the article really made rounds, that people got interested, and it was completely out of the blue for me because I didn't expect that it would cause any kind of attention, I decided that maybe I could put up the website and publish myself, because as you know, when you work with magazines, newspapers, you have no control of editorial policy. You have to sometimes beg them to publish something. And that's how Kali Tribune started and developed in the process. I'm not alone in this project. I have my friend Mihai Marinescu from Romania. So he's also publishing a lot. We have podcasts, and when I have time, I publish longer essays, which are the most important thing on various subjects.
I guess I just was wondering, just to give my listeners an idea, that the name, why Kali Tribune?
Everybody asks me that. It was an inside joke between me and my friends, and I would really like to change that name, but now that everybody knows it as KT, it became some kind of a brand, so it's stupid to change the name. It's from René Guénon. We were joking about the time in which we are living, that it is a kind of not the end times, but penultimate times, because it always seems like somebody is saying that world is going to end in this or that way, but this end is always postponed to infinity. So according to René Guénon, to simplify things a bit, and René Guénon, for those who don't know, was a French metaphysician.
Traditionalist school of perennialist thought, right?
No, that's how people label him, but no, he rejected that label, but those who follow him usually call themselves that way. But he had this idea that this is the idea about world cycles, huge epochs or aeons of world history that go towards a kind of dissolution of the world, and then again a rebuilding of the integral state of the world that Kali Yuga is in Indian, in Hindu. I wouldn't call it philosophy, let's call it thought. This period of complete decline, that when it reaches its limit, starts starts the inception of reintegration of the world, of situation when the lie or illusion becomes total. It has nothing else to hide behind, and then the truth just starts shining out and so on. I mean, I am of course simplifying things a bit, and not that I take this idea 100% truth, but I used it as a good metaphor. So that's why we called it Kali Tribune initially. Although, as I said, that was an inside joke, and inside joke for Croats. So who are in the know. So most people in the West couldn't really comprehend why somebody would call a website like that. But it's not. I'm not some kind of as you call them, traditionalist, perennialist. No. I just at the time I read a lot of René Guénon, and I do have a high opinion, although let's say somewhat with some reserves about him.
It's interesting, and we'll get right to Dugin after this, but I'm glad you mentioned Guénon, because I always find it interesting. There's all these people I know that will always talk about, oh, I am a traditionalist. I love the traditionalist school of thought. And I'm like, well, who do you read within it? And they'll always say Guénon, but then when you ask them about what they know about Guénon, they don't seem to know much. And it seems like a lot of people that claim to be traditionalists, they're just familiar with maybe the figure of Julius Evola.
Yeah, Julius Evola was something completely different. Although he and Guénon were pen pals, they were corresponding. Although if you read their correspondence, you can see that Guénon sized him up immediately that he is missing the point. Guénon was a peculiar man, and to this day, I'm not sure that I figured him out. What made him tick? Because what I like in him was that he had a genuine philosophical talent, or metaphysical talent, as he would call it, maybe. He was intellectual with the mind of a medieval monk or medieval scholastic. And I don't mean this metaphorically. He really taught in categories of pre-modern times. It's a very, very interesting thing. But what is very important in him, his idea of being in tradition, as he called it, or being out of the modern world, was not activist one. So it was more like not even attitude, but the mode of being, of personal being, if I could put it in that way, contemplative stance. And that is very obvious when people start to portray him as some kind of proto-fascist or, I don't know, right-wing radical or something like that. Those labels just don't stick. Whereas when you put them to somebody like Evola, they do stick, although Evola was far more radical than any fascist of his age. So he was not, what I want to say, he was not a political man. And his philosophy does not really have political implications in the sense that you could make a political movement out of it. You know, he observed history as something that we cannot really influence with our outward actions. We can influence history only in the sense of kind of reintegrating ourselves to common origin, to origin from which true religions sprang out, and classical philosophy and classical art, for instance, and such things. And that was the only act that he considered relevant in this sense, because the world, as Guénon understands it, is not kind of something that man can form by his own outward actions, with making revolutions, wars, and such things. But with this inner concentration of that brings forth kind of like culture, an atmosphere in which intellectual atmosphere in which people move. And in that sense, he was remarkable. I can give you one example. For instance, his understanding of medieval transcendental so-called philosophy of Thomas Aquinas was, in my opinion, some 50 years ahead of scholarship, because I found in some of his offhand remarks about Aquinas some things that people are only now discovering as essential features of Aquinas philosophy that give a completely new light, throw a new light on the whole scholastics. Now, this is a bit specialized philosophical subject, but it's a good example how peculiar this man was and how remarkable. And this is why I like it. But he had this, I think, maybe too optimistic view on Orient, on the East. Not so much East as a geographical term, but also like that too. But East as a kind of source of all spiritual substance in this world, whereas West is a totally botched, totally kind of like a place where everything goes into dissolution. I don't agree with that. That's just too radical for me, and I don't think well-grounded. But you cannot. How should I put it? He is very good if you want somebody, if you are a man of intellectual bent. And if you want somebody to turn you back to your own tradition, for instance, if you are Catholic, or I don't know, if you have a central ancestral tradition in which you are born, but you don't pay much heed about it, as most of us do, he is the guy who is able to turn the man back towards it, and from what I saw, in quite healthy way. It doesn't end up with people going into religious fanaticism or something like that, because he's very intellectual, and understanding him must be in steps, step by step, and then if he influences you, you know exactly why. There is nothing hidden. There is nothing subliminal in him, and that's very admirable quality in thinker. Something very rare. So that's why I appreciate Guénon.
Yeah, and I'm sorry we got sidetracked on Guénon, but I just wanted to talk about that because I think it illustrates that you're not one of these people who are talking about Guénon or figures that people associate Guénon, like the Kumra Swamis and whatnot. You're not. I think there are people that mention these names almost as like a chic online fashion thing. You're very scholarly and you take this very seriously. And I think your discussion just now of Guénon shows that. So I appreciate that. I guess now, with regards to Alexander Dugin, for listeners that don't know, how would you sum up, or who would you say Alexander Dugin is?
Well, Alexander Dugin is a philosopher. Most people denigrate him as a charlatan. I don't think he is a charlatan. I think he has genuine philosophical talent. I think also that he is extremely destructive man. It is one of the most destructive figures you can encounter in this internet public sphere today. This is my opinion. I'll try to explain why. People usually speculate about his influence on Russian politics. As you said in the beginning, that I don't know, you mentioned yourself and some other people are ridiculing him and so on, that he is a bit ridiculous. I'm ridiculing him because I kind of see some ridiculous things that come from his this greater Russian mentality, which I kind of recognize, and I like to poke fun at it. But there is nothing funny, in fact, about his ideas. And he is very serious about his ideas also. The other peculiar thing is that he's very quick to change them if it suits him. But as regards the seriousness of his figure in Russia, look, he is not Putin's brain, I think. That's how they
or
call
Putin's Rasputin as
Rasputin.
I feel like I'm not interrupting you here, but
yeah,
I feel as if he almost wants to play up that image at times, even if it's not necessarily true.
Yeah, look, you said that he was a disgraced academic. He was not disgraced because it is not disgrace in Russia to say "Ubi Ukrainca," kill Ukrainians. He said, I think in some. This is the reason why he lost the job, because he said, "Kill, kill." I say this as a professor. and they gave him a boot because at that time Russians, I presume Russians were still playing it safe. You know, they were fighting the info war, which they now lost deliciously. I mean, they screwed it up completely. But at that time, that was 2014 or 15. He was a bit of liability for them, so he got another job. In Russian public, things like that are not problem, and I'm making this inference from popularity of Dugin's most important, or maybe only important book, and that's Elementi Geopolitics, Foundations of Geopolitics. That's
which is the one book I think that it's very hard to get a good English translation of. All his other stuff can, but
no, it's not translated in English. You have some machine translation, Google translation,
right.
But I wouldn't recommend it. There's no point. I mean, a lot of ideas from that book you can find in some of his online articles that are precisely on the subject of geopolitics. But bearing in mind that he wrote that book for Russian public, it was published in 1997. He doesn't mince words as he does sometimes when he writes in English. So he writes in completely different terms. He doesn't put gloves on, so to speak. I mean, interesting thing about that book is it was the compilation of his lectures that he held on military academy in Moscow. If I remember correctly, that was, I don't remember which academy exactly, but it was for higher ranking military officers above the rank of colonel. So in that sense, well, that's pretty important. And those were 90s in Yeltsin era, and that book was sold out. It had, I don't know how many editions. It was very much read, but what we have to understand about Russia, excuse me, Dugin, ideas like Dugin, dime a dozen there. You know, you have a lot of other actors who are rehashing the similar ideas, and you have people who are more important to him, members of their Academy of Arts and Sciences, that have very similar this imperial ideology that he is pushing forward, but he's the most extreme. He's definitely the most extreme. And what I want to say about this book, Foundations of Geopolitics, everything that, this is my opinion.
And you've actually read the book. You've had a...
I read it 3 times. I think it's it's a very painful experience. Although it's an interesting book. I mean, if you want to know the mind of your enemy, something like that gives you some pleasure, then this book is really ultimate trip. Yeah, this book, that book is unprecedented exercises in megalomania. I mean, I never saw anything like that, because bear in mind it was written at the time Russia was at its low point. And this book is, in fact, a blueprint, an invitation to create the global Russian-centered empire. Now, what he means by that is very, at least ideologically sophisticated. But you have to understand that Russia haven't had capacities to govern itself, let alone the whole world, and it doesn't have now. But nevertheless, now they made a bid, at least as it seems to me, to reintegrate the space of former Soviet Union, starting with Ukraine. But as we can see from what is happening in the last month or so, they are not doing very well. But to the main idea of foundations of geopolitics. Now, Dugin's idea is that the whole history of the world is a conflict between land and sea. And when I say land and sea, I don't mean principles, I mean literally. This is something that is most of his readers in the West don't get. He takes these material facts of the masses of land, sea, mountains, and so on as causes of culture, of history, of everything. And the destiny, historical destiny of a given people is conditioned by its geographical position. And Russian position is the center of Eurasia, that is to say, this great landmass that encompasses, that goes from Dublin or Lisbon to Vladivostok. And he's using geopolitics to prove that the Russian destiny in history is a special destiny, that it is a world integrating destiny, that Russians have to integrate the civilization around themselves. Of course, he uses the ideas of other geopoliticians, people who started this science, or maybe even pseudoscience or political technique in 19th century to 20th century.
You mean like people like Mackinder and whatnot, or?
Yes. Mackinder is one of them. Mackinder is the one that mostly gets mentioned, but Dugin gives at the outset of the book, he gives you a history of geopolitical theories. Mackinder is very important to him. Other is Carl Schmitt and Karl Haushofer, Germans, because of the idea of Grossraum, the big space. And this is the idea that there are people who express the principle of sea or the principle of land in most perfect way, because they are situated as they are on the globe. And those are people that build civilization. And in order to build civilization, you have to have this Grossraum or a Lebensraum, the term that Nazis used. Grossraum is from Schmitt, Lebensraum is from Haushofer. But Lebensraum, this living space, this does not mean kind of like space that you can populate with your people while exterminating other people. This is not the original idea. The idea is that Grossraum is the space that can make this civilizational empire safe. And this is very important to understand why Ukraine is so important to Russia. And this is not only in Dugin, this is really something that obviously Russian politicians, Putin and others, have in mind, because big space is not merely Russia, but all the space around Russia that makes her safe. That includes countries that should be buffer zones, that should be some kind of borderlands between Russia and its enemies and so forth. And Ukraine is a key country in this sense, because it is the great plain that leads directly in the heart of European part of Russia. So this is one of the reasons one of the explanations why they see it as necessary to be incorporated in Russia. Because without Ukraine, Russia cannot be empire. And the trouble is, Dugin, and obviously many others in Russia, consider that Russia cannot exist unless it is empire. So it's
Well, why does he
either-or
believe that,
choice.
though? Well, why does Russia need to be an empire, according to Dugin?
Yeah, that's a good question, and there are a lot of very interesting ways to answer it. One is, for instance, is that Russia's destiny, as I already said, Russia's destiny is special because of its position, geographical position on the globe. Now, mind you, we have to bear in mind that when I say globe, I presume by this that geopolitics is by nature globalist. That's, I think, a lot of people don't get this detail. You cannot have geopolitics in the sense that Dugin understands it without having globalized world. So you couldn't have geopolitics in 13th century or 14th century in the true sense of the word, because it is, in Dugin's view, a science of global conflict between sea and the land. And all the values we consider moral or civilizational values, for instance, honor, family, patriotism on the one hand, or free markets, I don't know, free trade, free speech, even freedom of individual on the other hand, are in fact products of these geographical givens. So land civilization has more like this, let's say, Spartan virtues, whereas sea civilization has Athenian virtues, as he puts it in one place, because Athens was more mercantile city-state, while Sparta was a military, how should I call it, aristocracy. And globalization, in Dugin's view, created a situation where sea and land polarized into two blocks. On the one hand, you have total, as he calls it, teleocratic civilization, the land civilization, and this total sea civilization. And in our day and age, those are United States and its allies, which Russians call Euro-Atlantic Bloc. And on the other hand, Russia and the rest. And there will be inevitable clash, as we call it, Endkampf, the final war between the two, and which hopefully he is convinced the land civilization will win. And now, why it is destined so? Well, Dugin is incorporating, I would say, all the worst aspects of this Russian messianic worldview that was always present in Russian culture, that is present even in the greatest instances of Russian culture, that is present in Dostoevsky, it is present in Solzhenitsyn, you name it. And it is above all present in Russian Orthodox Church, let us not forget. But in Dugin, it is purified to its essence, and it is the main thing. He calls Russians Narod Bogonosets. This means the God-bearing people, or Narod Christonosets, the Christ-bearing people. That Russians have, in Dugin's view, a kind of special kind of universality that is different than what he calls Western universality. By Western universality, he means this formal universality of human rights, of free market, or such things, or everything that you can imagine, I mean, that grew out of Western Anglo-Saxon culture. And whereas Russians have universality that is concrete, they are universalist people. Wherever Russians come, people integrate around them. And this integration has eschatological meaning, that is to say, this is salvation. They are bound to save the world by incorporating the world into this global tellurocratic land empire, Eurasian empire.
Is this like, people use the term Pax Americana, right? Is it almost like he wants a Pax Russica?
Yes, precisely. Not only, you guessed it. That's what he's doing all the time. He wants to give a mirror image of institutions. For instance, a trilateral commission that you have. This is like think tank, or no, it's not think tank. Economic forum that is meant to join Japan, Europe, and United States in their sphere of influence for economic planning, let's say. He wants the trilateral commission of Eurasian type. So just making a mirror image. So that's throughout the foundations of geopolitics.
So that's really interesting, because
yes,
he says he's anti-globalist, but it sounds like what you're describing is he just wants a different form of globalism or globalization.
Absolutely. As I told you, geopolitics, for Dugin, geopolitics is an ultimate science. So as Hegel would say, for instance, that philosophy is an absolute science, in the sense that philosophy can give you the total knowledge, as Hegel believed in his time. So the Dugin believes geopolitics is absolute science. It transcends all other sciences. And its final end is the global domination, unification of the world. And it is inconceivable, as I already said, without globalization. So he is globalist in that sense, absolutely, because he says that original form of this conflict of land and sea can be observed on the conflict of the Rome and Carthage, because Carthage was a mercantile Phoenician civilization, whereas Romans were land power. And there is truth in that. Now, let's be clear. Geopolitics is not some kind of, weaving illusions and so on and so forth. If you read the Western geopoliticians, some of whom he copiously quotes, that had very much influence on politics, these really are vectors of geopolitics. But what Dugin does with this, he turns this into eschatology, into global eschatology. And to get back only to one thing you asked me about this special role of Russians. Now, it's interesting what he thinks by Russian people. Russian people are not so much ethnic Russians. Russian people is more like metaphysical substance. That is the people of the empire. If there is no empire, there is no Russian people. This is very dangerous thought, and I'll get back to that. Dangerous for Russians, because this is something very similar to what you had in Nazism, where at the end of the war, when it was obvious that they will lost, that Nazis will lost, there was this scorched earth policy, because Hitler said, I will paraphrase him, Germans lost their destiny. They got defeated. Now they don't deserve to exist. On Dugin's logic, if Russians are not capable of building an empire, they don't deserve to exist. And that's very worrisome. If I were a Russian, I would be very worried about such idea. So why are they chosen in Dugin's view? Because they have this incorporated. He understands church, state, and the people as one entity, and this is very hard to comprehend. Now, I understand this, that is to say, better, I recognize this when I see it, because I'm from Croatia. We had very troubled past, present, and will have probably very troubled future with Serbia that has very similar political national idea from the 19th century onwards. So I recognize this mentality. It's very peculiar. It's very hard to comprehend to people who live further west who never were in contact with something like that. And this is the idea where they incorporate you as they want to do with Ukraine. I give you an example. They entered Ukraine not as with this invasion, not as an enemy state, but as a part of Russia, with Russians that forgot that they are Russians. With the Russians, that is Ukrainians, that were seduced by Nazis and so on and so forth. If the Ukrainians waved their hands and said we surrender, nothing would happen. I mean, they would take down their country, they would take down their government, install their puppets, and everything would be okay. What Ukrainians did, they said, no, we are Ukrainians. And they united, the whole country united around this. And then this is unfortunately a call for genocide from Russians, because they cannot comprehend, if they decided somehow that you are part of this body of the Russian people and you deny this, then you are screwed. Then they go for destruction, because this idea of universality that Dugin praises in Russian people is the universality that cannot comprehend other, with big O, you know. It is idea of Christian universality, where you have church that has to encompass all peoples, but this church is identified with single particular people, single particular country, and this country then has to expand. What should have been a kind of spiritual missionary work becomes a work of conquest. That's how I see it. It's pretty hard to put in words to really pinpoint it, because very idea is a kind of political mysticism. You know, it's not rational. But this is, in a way, how Dugin puts it. I merely paraphrased some of his thoughts from Foundations of Geopolitics.
So there's a lot to unpack there, but I'm recalling. I remember someone on the far right said, Dugin isn't necessarily always like us. Like I forget if it was someone from one of these racialist websites saying they were more concerned with race, whereas Dugin is more concerned with space, empire, and time. Mm-hmm. Is that a good assessment of Dugin? Is that his sort of obsession, yes. Space, empire, and time?
Space, I don't know about time, space, and empire. Definitely race, no, absolutely not, because this is completely different understanding of ethnicity and nationality. Race is important in Anglo-Saxon world. Even in us, in Eastern Europe, race was never the issue. But this doesn't make him any better. This is far worse, because the problem of space. Now, this is interesting. He is constantly thinking in spatial terms, because he starts and ends his thought in the ground, in the land. Not land as some kind of poetic metaphor, not land as a kind of loom of the land of your childhood or something sentimental, but simply soil. It's completely, utterly materialistic metaphysics. He wants this land to expand. He cannot comprehend the state in which Russia would not expand, because it has to encompass everything. It cannot stop. And I have to make a caveat here. By this Eurasian empire, he doesn't mean global Russia, but Russia as a center around which would be satrapies of Russia, other cultures that are nevertheless under the thumb of Russia and Russian empire and imperial ideology. He doesn't consider it to be ideology, but he considers it to be the normal state of human beings, into which human beings will return after Russia dominates the whole globe. So it's not, what I want to say, it's not expansion of ethnic Russians. This is very important to understand. This is expansion of an idea. And trouble is, people like Dugin, not only him, but he puts it very simply. He doesn't differentiate between imagination and the real space, imagined space and real space. When he says, for instance, Ukraine is a part of Russia up to, I don't know how many kilometers, what border to Carpathians or something like that. For him, that's, once he imagines this, for him, this is already reality. And the wars that he can wage then are just means to make this reality obvious. This is, I know that this is very convoluted, but I'm trying to get into his head a bit, because most people don't do when they talk about Dugin, and I think it's very important. You know why? Because there are a lot of Dugin's works on internet. There are lots of Dugin books. I read a lot of them about philosophy, about postmodernism, about this or that. Some of his writings are excellent. Some seem very metaphysically oriented, but this is not true. The only important thing for him is this politics, this geopolitics, the land and sea, and everything else, this fourth political theory, claptrap, all those things are games. Those are like illusions he puts, maybe not even intentionally, but he tells people in the West what the people in the West want to hear.
It's almost as if there is an English Dugin and a Russian Dugin.
Yes. But he's a kind of guy, you know, Edward Limonov, you know who he is, that Russian writer.
I'm familiar with Limonov, yes.
Yeah, they were friends for some time. They had this National Bolshevik Party, and Edichka said that with Sasha Dugin, it was he was like that octopus that always changes colors. Put him among fascists, he is a fascist. Put him among communists, he becomes communist. He was part of, with Zyuganov, of this communist, revived Russian Communist Party. I think he wrote even their earliest draft of their program, party program. So he has absolutely no problem with that. But the core idea is constant in him. And this core idea is very brutal, absolutely insane, eschatological
If I could interrupt
war. Yes, of course.
It sounds like, you know, in case people don't know, so when we hear the term eschaton, I think the definition that I have pulled up, it's used in theology to refer to the final event in the divine plan, or the end of the world. And to me, when I think of Dugin, in a lot of ways, he wants to do what I remember William F. Buckley, the conservative thinker, once said, don't immanentize the eschaton.
Yeah.
He wants to immanentize the eschaton. That seems to be what Dugin's goal is.
Absolutely. Do you know where this term comes from, immanentizing the eschaton?
If you could go on and explain.
Yeah, I thought you heard of it. That's Eric Vogelin, German philosopher. Yeah, he's a German philosopher, very underrated. Not that your leftist listeners would very much like him, but I would advise giving a look. Nevertheless, because he was not the kind of guy that would go alienating people on political basis, but he was immanentizing of eschaton is his term, and I think he was the master of recognizing individuals like Dugin for what they were. Although he struck both left and right in that sense, and he would have a ball with Dugin. And also, yes, immanentizing the eschaton means closing off the transcendence. By transcendence, I mean that which is beyond history. And in Christianity, for instance, the salvation is beyond history, it's beyond life. beyond personal life. It's always something that transcends temporal given. Immanentizing the eschaton would mean to negate that there exists anything outside history, anything outside matter and for instance, your individual life, but inserting into this confined space this absolute idea of absolute salvation. And Dugin is absolutely doing that. He's doing that even in these theological terms. That's why he uses a lot of metaphysics. That's why you'll find René Guénon in him, or Platon, Aristotle. But his main inspiration, by the way, in that sense, is Martin Heidegger. He is philosophical muse. So yes.
So why is that? Why is Heidegger his philosophical muse? Well, for the lay audience that may not understand why.
Well, Heidegger is a very very peculiar thinker. Heidegger's idea was that, to put it as simply as I can, that the whole history of the West, of the Western civilization, from Plato onwards, is kind of developing a subtle philosophical error that is alienating man from what Heidegger calls being. And I won't go into that, that will get us too far. But let us say, for the sake of this subject, that something went wrong 2 millennia and a half ago, and there is Heidegger to show us what went wrong and how we can rectify it. And Heidegger's idea was that the whole this technological world, the world of modernity, and now postmodernity, that is to say, world of technology falling apart, is in fact caused by metaphysics. That is to say, that started with Platon, with Aristotle, and then Middle Ages, and in the German philosophy, and coming to him who wants to demolish this. And that this metaphysics kind of hid the true authentic relationship that man can have with being. And being in Heidegger is something that cannot be defined. This is a term used in philosophy. I won't try to explain it, but when you talk about Heidegger, you kind of have a very difficult time to explain to people what is it that Heidegger wants us to experience so we become authentic and world again becomes innocent or whatever he wants. It boils down, in my opinion, in Heidegger, in an attempt to create a new beginning in philosophy and in politics. That will break out of completely from civilization. Because I know, as I studied Heidegger, and I studied philosophers whom Heidegger butchered in his books, like Plato or Aristotle, he was, for instance, his writings on Aristotle are, in fact, complete intentional misrepresentation of Aristotle. He tries to put his own, let's say, his own vision of what Aristotle is in this eschatological history onto actual Aristotle, whereas this has nothing to do with reality. An attempt is to break out from the civilizational nexus, to break out from constraints of tradition, let's say, which is paradox because Heidegger is by most understood as some kind of traditionalist. He's not anything but. And this is one of the reasons why probably he fell for Nazism in Germany, as he was a party member. I think until 1945 he was paying his dues. Party membership, although he wasn't Nazi in a sense that Bormann was or Himmler or somebody. But he saw, for instance, I'll give you an example because to see how peculiar this thought is. He thought that Nazism is breaking through this globalization, this domination of technology and the world without values, as he considered it. But instead of going towards Plato and Aristotle, and from Christianity to his own tradition, he tried to deconstruct this the transition. By the way, the term deconstruction is, I think Jacques Derrida was first to take it from Heidegger's term destruction of traditional ontology, and so on. It's very influential on these postmodern philosophers. And Dugin takes him into consideration because Dugin needs to have a principle that cannot be rationally explained. For instance, like Russian people. Russian people for Dugin is something that he cannot really confine in definition. And in Heidegger's thought, the subject of philosophy, the being that thinks, the being that is center of history is Dasein, which means being there, literally. And this is a German word to express existence, let's say, something that is, but not as a thing, more like a presence. And this being is man insofar as man has a comprehension of being in general, of his place in the world, of meaning of the world, and so on. And Heidegger needs, Dugin needs such a term because he needs a being that is not, that cannot be defined by traditional terms, because we humans have human nature. And we can say, for instance, man is a being capable of thought, rational being. But Dugin doesn't want that. He wants a special Russian man, Russian Dasein, Russian being that cannot be really confined into these classical traditional categories. Now, you can I understand this is very convoluted, but I'm talking about two very convoluted thinkers here, but I think you can see now that there is nothing really traditionalist about this. This is very postmodern. In fact,
Not to interrupt you, but I was going to bring up, since you mentioned that, there's a very interesting BBC interview where the BBC interviewer keeps saying to Dugin, but that doesn't line up with the facts. And Dugin says, there are no facts, there are only interpretations. It is your postmodernity that shows us that. And if you accept postmodernity, you must accept our special postmodern Russian truth. And I always thought that was a very interesting line coming from him.
Yeah, because it suits him. But you have to, he is a postmodernist in this sense. If you want to see postmodernity as a step forward from modernity into nothingness, Dugin is absolutely that. There is nothing in him that tries to go back to some kind of as I said in the beginning in Genon, this luminous tradition of spiritual formation of humankind. If anything, when we're talking about taking a step back, Dugin wants to step back even beyond man, not like post-humanists who want to go beyond man into future, robotic man or augmented man. He wants to step back into, complete barbarism, in chaos, in fact, because chaos is a principle that he holds as an origin of his philosophy. And he thinks that postmodernity can accommodate chaos, and that it can accommodate, for instance, as he said in that interview, it can accommodate special Russian truth. And as I said before, metaphysics of chaos, fourth political theory, Dugin writing about Orthodox theology. All those things are insignificant. Everything is about
even his not to interrupt you, but even his at one point he sort of associates with and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but chaos magic and things of that nature, correct?
Yes, I would probably dabbled in the books of. I was, to tell you the truth, I forgot about the authors who are writing that chaos magic things. But chaos, concretely, the principle of chaos is something that he tends to mention every now and then as a philosophical principle. That is to say, as what we call in philosophy arche, the origin. But you have in ancient Greek cosmogonies, those are like in Hesiod, those are poems on the generation of gods, because Greek gods were born. They had this notion of gods being parts of the world. You have this chaos house, which interestingly enough in Greek this means like a ravine or a hole. I don't know the right English word to translate it. Something very mundane. A house was a principle, and sometimes it is identified with night, nix, like an origin of things that gets inseminated by light, let's say, or by heavens or something like that. And this is the principle that Dugin would like to see as the only principle, because as he say, a house encompasses everything, and it also encompasses logos. As you know, probably in postmodernity, they like to call logos tyrannical, masculine, blah, blah, blah. Dugin agrees with all that. And what is interesting in this fine Orthodox believer, logos is also identified with Jesus Christ. And the way Dugin puts it, he is also identifying logos with him in a sense, and denigrates it to an utmost, because he wants chaos. And chaos would be the principle in which nothing has an intelligible structure anymore. It's like a night without any speck of light. And supposedly from that night, some things, new things, never seen, could emerge into this world. New thoughts, new philosophies, new countries. I think that it is obvious when you read he has this essay on chaos principle, metaphysics of chaos, that this is a kind of invocation of the underworld, as Freud said, acheron movebo, I will move to pity the gods of underworld. It's like he's invoking what is the lowest of the low, because in metaphysics it is very important that orientation. So you have orientation upwards, you have orientation downwards. When in metaphysics you said God is the first cause of all things, you don't think in the sense that he is below, that he is in the depth of things, but he's above, because light comes above. Everything that is illuminating, that is comprehensible, that is soothing even, comes from above. But what comes from below is opposite, obviously. And Dugin always, that I noticed at the beginning, first time reading him, he always inverts. He wants to find absolute below. And I think that Dugin's fundamental idea is to reach a subhuman state. As some people in the West would like to be posthumans, he would like to be subhuman. Which is worse? I don't know.
So I'm curious, he sort of takes up all these different, I don't want to say personas, but you know, 1 second it's Dugin the Traditionalist, then it's the Russian Dugin, the English Dugin, the Gnostic Dugin, the Chaos Dugin, the Fourth Political Theory Dugin, the Foundation of Geopolitics Dugin. It gets really complex, and I'm just wondering, you know, it seems like he's playing a lot of different games with how he portrays himself to the public. He has these images, and I'm curious. This may seem off topic, but are you familiar with a book known as Dugin Against Dugin by Charles Upton?
Yeah, I am. I corresponded with Mr. Upton, but haven't read the book.
I'm curious because, I mean, I feel like Upton's view is that Dugin, he views Dugin, he takes a traditionalist critique of fourth political theory. He basically views Dugin as more or less a Satanist. And Wahid Azal, who I recently had on, recommended you because I had asked about potential connections between Dugin and this group known as the Order of Nine Angles, which for people that don't know, the Order of Nine Angles, from my understanding, these are Satanists that like taking up different personas constantly.
Yes.
You know, could you talk about this? Is there a connection there?
I don't think that there is a personal connection between Dugin and anybody from that circle, but Order of the Nine Angles is, from what I know about them, it's more like a franchise than a movement. You know, they have these principles laid out, so everybody can not join, but start practicing it. What you just mentioned, that's what they call insight role. It is completely to the point. I don't think that Dugin influenced anybody there, or vice versa, but this is a kind of complete depersonalization. So if you are capable to completely take a role of good husband, and on your Saturday night out, you make a terrorist attack, in which you kill, for instance, your parents-in-law, and then you get back to your family and act as a grieving son-in-law, then you are depersonalized. There is nothing in you that reacts to anything. And this is the aim. As I remember, I wrote about Order of Nine Angles. My memory is a bit rusty, but the idea is to achieve what they call a causal state. And that would be a state of chaos, because chaos is the absence of any reason or cause, where you cannot really see what comes from what. But it is also the space where nothing is conditioned by anything, except perhaps your pure will, because they want, and this is satanic, where your will should be completely creative, in a sense that you create yourself, that you create your own reality. Although Order of the Nine Angles has also some very concrete political aims, and similar thing with Duginism. Dugin is that the whole metaphysical claptrap that can get very subtle, because as I remember reading some of the materials allegedly by David Mayat under pseudonym Anton Long, they are very subtle. He has this interpretation of Heidegger that is very to the point. Very good understanding of ancient Greek. But I think those things are all irrelevant. The only relevant thing for them is the creation of what they call it, galactic imperium, the Fourth Reich in outer space, or something like that. Aims are completely political, and that's what I want to stress again about Dugin. That's also the situation in Dugin, and the people who are looking for some kind of metaphysics or spirituality are knocking at the wrong door. He's not writing those books in order to tackle philosophical problems. He is writing them to make Russia world empire. This is his main motive.
Okay. So it sounds like there isn't necessarily a connection between the Order of Nine Angles and Dugin, but there may be like a parallel in the way that, for instance, so David Mayat goes from neo-Nazi to jihadist to Satanist, and it's sort of like how Dugin goes from Nazgul to traditionalist to Eastern Orthodox. He's always jumping around, and it seems like Dugin creates a lot of smoke screens.
That's very similar mentality. But what I want to say is I cannot make any meaningful connection between persons. Although, for as far as I remember, Order of the Nine Angles, you don't really know who is in Order of Nine Angles. I think it is a creation of one man. In fact, that this is all created by this guy Mayat. of course, I cannot prove it. I wouldn't bother because people who research this peculiar topic tend to get drowned into it because it's complicated. It's completely fringe, but in a strange sense, fascinating. And it's better not to give it too much thought. But
and a lot of times when you get pulled into the fascination, yes. I think a lot of people end up becoming part of the mythology, or they start to help mythologize these characters, that they come under the spell of it in a weird way.
Yes, and they give them significance that they don't have, unfortunately. But okay, I mean, I have to be honest. The guy or the people who created this Order of the Nine Angles, this is in a perverse sense admirable what they created. They had this. As I recall, some kind of game, complicated board game that they used like initiation. Then you have this very elaborated system, metaphysical, let's say, inverted commas system. This is not something that is easy to pull off. I mean, it's something that requires considerable dedication. But as I tell you, there are no connection that I know of, although people who are in this sphere of, I don't know, Dugin and such people who follow Dugin, who maybe form some kind of small political parties with Duginist ideas, will probably come across Order of the Nine Angles people. This is very similar. This is the same vibe. As you said, with this example of this depersonalization of inside role, it's absolutely similar, and I think works on the same principle. And the principle is chaos.
So there were just one or two more things I wanted to ask you about. Mm-hmm. You once referred to Dugin as the serpent snake oil salesman. Why the serpent? What I mean, do you see Dugin as a? I mean, I believe I was told that you were Catholic. Do you see Dugin as almost a satanic sort of character in some ways, or having satanic characteristics in a very abstract sense?
Dugin is, you put it in a quite good terms, abstract sense, because he's philosophical Satanist. I mean, principle, when you invert, look, when you say there is God above, and then somebody says, no, God is below, that's philosophical Satanism, because you invert the principle. But in Dugin, you have one other thing. He has this appetite for destruction. I was listening to one of his speeches now, I think maybe a month old. So when Ukraine war already started, I was astonished how composed he is, because they are losing war. They made a king-size screw-up in Ukraine, Russians. But Dugin doesn't seem to be bothered. And as my friend Mihai, my friend and collaborator for Kali Tribune, noticed, whenever he says word destruction, destroyed, he seems like in ecstasy. He's so happy. He seems so tranquil. Because if you ever listen to Dugin speak, he is not an unpleasant guy. I could maybe few years ago, before everything happened, if you put him at the same table with him, we would have a lot to talk about. And I'm sure he's a very charming man and so on. But it's very interesting to see that he can throw ideas out that are hair-raising, that can make your blood freeze, with the smile of a child, with complete innocence, in composure. But I think he's very destructive guy. I read some things about his younger days in Moscow and so on, and it was not really growing up I would recommend to anyone. So
anything in particular that stood out to you?
And he was a member of this Luzhinsky circle with what was his name, Golyovin. One guy who was a poet. They were dissident underground in the early 80s Moscow. So they practice, they call it enlightenment through debauchery, through drinking and whatnot. I shudder to think what they did. So he's very chaotic. He was known as a very chaotic, very intense youth. I remember reading about one author who was a part of the circle when he first showed up as an 18-year-old kid, that nobody could get his eyes from him. He was so intense, wild, full of energy, but he's utterly destructive. That's when he was anti-Soviet dissident, but he changed his mind very soon. He loves the Soviet Union now.
Now, the last two things I wanted to ask you about is when it comes to religious matters, it's hard for me to comment because I would say I often tell people I'm sort of a fallen Catholic.
Yeah.
You know, but it's interesting to me with Dugin. I feel as if his ideology is, in a lot of ways, very based around the temporal world. And maybe I'm wrong about that, but I feel like he's seducing Christians into heresy, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, yeah, he does. But Christians that get seduced by him deserve nothing better, in my opinion. And this rather harsh statement of mine comes from experience. Look, there are a lot of people who are kind of shopping for religions on the internet. So, and they're in fact looking for some kind of belief system to feel good. So they become Orthodox, but then they become Catholic, but then Catholicism doesn't fit them, but then they go into some of these more extreme traditionalist forms of Catholicism and so on and so forth. Anybody who is genuinely religious, and look, if you are Catholic under 30 years old, it would be peculiar if you are not following Catholic, because in genuine religion, there is necessary period of life almost for most people in which they see themselves on quite the opposite side of the religion they belong to, and then maybe they start to revert towards it. Anybody who has that in him, who has this kind of sensus fidelium, who has this sense of maybe not even sacred, but right or wrong, will sniff him out, you know, because no matter what he writes about Russian Orthodox Church and its perfect symphony of church and state and so on, you'll sense that something's wrong with that guy. I mean, Russians, not only Dugin. Dugin is in this sense insignificant. Russians in general, with their propaganda, have pulled a lot of people into really personal meltdowns and ambits. I had very ugly experiences now as this Ukraine thing started with this invasion. I don't comment on politics that much, but this is de facto Third World War, so I cannot but not comment. And people who perceived that I'm supporting Ukrainians quite naturally from my position cut ties with me. I mean, attacked me, which is not a problem in itself, but the arguments they used were arguments that are completely taken from Russian propaganda. There are, well, I want to say, huge number of people in the West that are using internet for information are being brainwashed by Russians. Although good thing is that Russians screwed up this operation totally. I mean, information warfare. If they went step by step in Ukraine, they would have get what they wanted, I think. But with this abrupt attack, everybody now sees them for what they are.
It's interesting that you had mentioned, and I didn't even think to mention this, but you talked about how everyone online is always shopping for some ideology or spirituality, and someone is always selling them the, oh, I will give you the secret knowledge, Do you think there's a connection between Duginism and maybe like a form of Gnosticism? Or I don't know how to put it because I'm not I'm not a scholar on spirituality, but
Yes.
there seems to be a Gnostic element to Dugin.
Yes, for instance, we mentioned Derek Vogelin. He would call him Gnostic right off the bat because he used Vogelin thought that most of the ideological currents of modernity are in fact Gnostic. Modernization of all Gnostic heresies, let's call them heresies. Dugin is definitely Gnostic. Sometimes he calls himself Gnostic. Because some of these ideas, for instance, this chaos principle, or for instance, this idea of femininity, the femininity of chaos, those are very Gnostic ideas. And the most important thing, he has a Gnostic style of writing, especially at the time when he was still drinking. You kind of can recognize when he was under influence. Some of his essays I read in Serbian translation are very funny to read, but he uses this Gnostic imagery, snakes, poison, chaos, always this dark imagery that was very peculiar for Gnostics. So he is, I think, because Gnostics, immanentizing the eschaton, that was a Gnostic thing, I would say, although, of course, these ancient Gnostic, we don't know that much about them, but judging by their writings, yes, that comes in very similar, if not the same category as Dugin.
So the last thing I wanted to ask you about, and I asked Wahidus all about this as well, there's one quote that comes from Dugin that has always stuck out to me, and I always want to understand it and get people's thoughts on how they interpret it. But Dugin has said, he has this bombastic line, "We will cure you with poison." What does he mean by that, in your view?
If I remember correctly, this is a short essay on Westerners. That means you and me. More you than me because I'm Slav in Eastern Europe, but never mind. He lumps us all under the West. I think that by this he means this is very probably Gnostic symbol, which I cannot now really pinpoint the source. It sounds very Gnostic. He is talking about the way he wants to see Russians saving us from ourselves by incorporating us into Eurasian Empire. I'm certain of this because everything, as I mentioned a few times before, everything is about that. Everything is a political globalist project. Nothing else is important. Those are only metaphors he uses with one and only one purpose. And he said in one instance that, by the way, he considers, he's very popular in America. He's more popular in the United States than in Russia. Americans are irredeemable for him. This is not the matter of choice. If you are born and formed as a member of thalassocratic sea empire of America, the modern Carthage, as he calls it, you are beyond redemption. At one place he says, we can love Westerners the way we love damned souls in hell. It's an interesting thing. Russian Orthodox have this strange propensity for this idea that devil himself will be saved and so on, as so-called apokatastasis. You have it in Dostoevsky, and Dugin now displays it. That's the way he sees us. And, well, this makes us uncurable, I guess, only maybe through total warfare, where we will be reduced to civilizational nothingness and rebuilt again.
It's really interesting that you mentioned that because I've seen some of his English videos for his little show. I think it's called Dugin's Viewpoint or something along those lines. But you watch the English versions and he'll talk about the American people and he'll say, and I'm always amazed when I find like Americans that are into Dugin, because when he talks about America in his English language broadcasts, he says, and the Americans, they are a simple people. They are a simple, we must support their simpleness. They support Trump because they are a simple people. He's basically calling Americans and Westerners morons. He's calling them idiots.
Yes, he does. Yes, he does. And this this can show you what kind of vivid imagination exists in Russian culture, especially political culture, because they believe, I'm certain of it, people like him are probably that crazy Putin. They really think that they can pull this off, that they are superior, that they can take on NATO. They cannot take on NATO. I mean, in a conventional sense, they can start nuclear war, but I don't think that they will gain much from that. And this is option on the table, by the way. And Dugin also spoke about it. Yeah? And it is the truth. Yeah, he in fact doesn't have high opinion of Americans. As I told you, it's not simply that you are morons. It's that you should not exist. And this is what people don't understand, because sometimes, I mean, I'm not American and I come from the culture that is rather different, but I know a lot of Americans. And sometimes I'm in position that I'm defending USA from them, because they are so critical of their country and culture that I have to step in and say, you are not right. America used to have at least excellent universities. There were times when America was a leading country in literacy in the world. Now it's not, but well, maybe it will be again or something like that, optimistic. And then they start telling me about Americans detonating the atom bomb, whereas Russians never detonating an atom bomb. Well, maybe that will change. So, I don't know.
I have to ask, because this conversation, I guess what always ends up being my roadblock with Dugin, and this will be the final thing here, is, you know, I think a lot of times, if I'm honest, I come from maybe a view of, you know, scientific empiricism, or there's people that come from rationalism. I get the impression that Dugin doesn't come from those type of epistemologies. So in a lot of ways, there's no way to understand him if you come from certain epistemologies that aren't based in his sort of mysticism, if that makes sense.
He comes from kind of philosophy that is in my blood, literary, and this is maybe the reason why he pisses me off so much that I write about him, because he takes it and destroys it. It uses it, it inverts it. Although I have to tell you one thing about this geopolitics, on which I always get back. The best epistemological definition of Dugin's geopolitics would be dialectical materialism, because it is a dialectic of pure matter, of pure geological, geographical givens. And at one place, he even calls it that. So all this, what seems to you like mysticism and such, is not really mysticism. It's more like a kind of materialism, intoxicated materialism. I don't know.
Do you see him as connected to like the same traditions as, say, Karl Marx, or?
Yes, but he said that one should read René Guénon like Marx. A dialectical materialism is simply a principle, and contradictory one, I might add. It's very hard to understand how matter can be dialectical of itself. But in this clash of sea and land, this is the pure dialectics. You have two opposites that are in conflict, that are not going towards what Hegel called Versöhnung, reconciliation, but ultimate conflict. They cannot be reconciled. So they have to create a new state that will come after the destruction of the one of the opposites. Or
why do you say that it's a dialectical materialism that's intoxicated, though? And that last thing there.
Intoxication part comes because it has this mystical atmosphere around it. And there's a very similar thing is national mysticism. When people, you don't have that in USA, in fact, in this sense, but you have some people in Eastern Europe. I saw that when nationalism becomes a kind of religion, And this is it becomes a religion of maybe blood and soil. For instance, in Dugin's case, is more a religion of soil. Blood does not, race does not play a role. Really, he's sincere there. And from this intoxication with that pretty banal material given, he creates a kind of philosophical poetry. But when you take this philosophical poetry back to its origin, you see there is nothing at the bottom. It's completely shallow, empty. That's what I meant.
Well, I want to thank you, Franco Malik, for coming on Parallax Views. Any last words, or what do you hope that my listeners get out of this conversation, and how can they keep up with your work?
Well, your listeners are probably not interested in Dugin, and I recommend not to get interested in him. I don't know what to say. I hope I was being articulate enough. This can get pretty complicated, and that's more or less it. I don't have anything further to add.
Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Franco Malik of the Kali Tribune. And of course, if you support the work here I do at Parallax Views, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/Parallax Views. Should be releasing some more Patreon bonus content this month, including a new series that started last month with C. Derek Varn, formerly of Zero Books. So, one more time, patreon.com/Parallax Views if you wish to support the work I'm doing. I've slowed down a bit because it is the summer, and I have some issues to attend to here at home, but I plan on releasing more content this month. So, with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.